Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Roland Zenology Pro tutorial. A bit of a challenging episode for us today. We're going to talk about oscillator combinations. There's various different ways that we can combine oscillators together in Zenology. And this is an area that's, I think, of primary interest to experimental sound design because the results can be so unpredictable and sometimes acoustically violent. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the links below. Patreon and YouTube channel membership. Okay, let's get on with it. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I've just changed my tuner. I've just downloaded this tuner called G-Tune from gvst.co.uk. One of the examples that I'm going to talk about today, the Steinberg tuner simply wasn't cutting it, and this tuner seems to be a little bit more sensitive, so I've switched that out. And I've also built myself the simplest possible sound palette to play with today. So I've got some what I've called pure sine, but they're not actually pure sine tones. If it was, you'd only have one harmonic. So this is the virtual analog synthesizer's implementation of a sine wave, which isn't absolutely perfect, but it is pretty smooth. I've also taken out the filters completely, so all of the filters are off, and I've set my amp curves to flat and the levels to 100. So I've tried to stabilize the sound as much as I possibly can. When we're combining multiple oscillators together, if you've got any hope at all of understanding what's going on, you want the simplest possible test harness to play in. So here we have a sine wave. Let's call it a sine wave for today's purposes. I've also dialed exactly the same sound into partial 2. Now if I turn both of those partials on simultaneously, you're going to get a sine wave that's twice as loud. So here's one partial with a volume of minus 13-ish. When I bring both partials in, the sound is 6 decibels louder, in other words, double the volume. So far so good. We're going to deal with ring modulation first as the first example of oscillator cross-pollination. Basically what ring modulation does is multiplies these two waves together. Now, the maths behind ring modulation is beyond me, frankly. I prefer to think of ring modulation as a sum and difference engine. If I had a pure sine tone, if this synthesizer was capable of generating a pure sine tone, what you would get if you multiply two sine tones together is a result where the frequencies of both of those sine tones are added together for a sum, and they're also subtracted one from the other for a difference. So if I had two sine tones at 250 Hertz, then I would end up with a ring modulation effect of 500 Hertz and 0 Hertz. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. With just partial 1 and no ring modulation, you've got a fundamental frequency of 261 Hertz, and here it is, the loudest of the peaks. When I engage ring modulation, the loudest peak is going to be double 261-ish, so somewhere in the region of 523, and there it is. Now, can you see this stuff down at the bottom? And can you also see an absence of any indication in the tuner as to what's going on? This is where the Steinberg tuner simply could not handle this. What's effectively happening is that we don't have a perfect summation and subtraction. Some of that energy at or around 0 Hertz is being retained, and it's messing with the tuner. And a really elegant way to solve it, and this is kind of a cool little trick, is that if you engage a high-pass filter on both of these oscillators, but basically make it do nothing. So here you can see I've turned the high-pass filter on, but as far as the graphical editor's concerned, it's kind of letting everything through. Well, actually it isn't. This tiny little tail at the end is just attenuating the very lowest inaudible frequencies, and the difference between the high-pass filter being on and off is the difference between the tuner being able to figure out what's going on and not. And now you can see the tuner's correctly identifying 523 Hertz, which is the fundamental, and all of that nasty low energy, or most of it, has been attenuated. So this is ring modulation. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing the sum and differences of two waves combined together. Now, at the moment, we're just dealing with very simple pseudo-sine waves, and so it's not a particularly exciting effect. But things get much more interesting the moment we do anything other then combine two identical sine waves together. Just before I go any further, I'm going to turn partial 2 back on. Don't be fooled. The moment you have the structure set to anything other than off, this button here is basically useless. Because partial 2 is now being used as, depending on your context, it's either called a master oscillator or a modulating oscillator. Basically, it's informing partial 1. Then whether or not you've got this button turned on or off is irrelevant. Now, this is a quirk of the Roland interface. I'm not a particularly big fan of it either because it's really confusing. It doesn't make any difference whether I turn this button on or off. I'm going to leave it on because it lets us play with Oscillator 2's settings, and they are impacting the sound here because these two waves are being combined. I'm going to make partial 1, which we're now going to call the carrier wave. That's the correct parlance when you're talking about combining multiple oscillators together. And we've got a little bit more of an interesting sound. But where ring modulation really comes into its own is when you start messing with the pitch of the modulating wave. If I set the coarse tune of the modulating wave to one single semitone above, then we find ourselves in the special effects department of the BBC in like the early 1960s because we have Daleks. So a huge number of special effects in sci-fi programs in the 60s were generated with ring modulators because it's such a violent metallic sound. Now let's jump over to Pro Edit, and this is why I decided to start with the ring modulator today, because it lets me talk about these different level settings in the Pro Edit screen, and then we're going to go back and have a look at sync and figure out there's something a little bit wrong here. What we've got with the ring modulator is ring 1-2 level is the sound of the modulator, but you can also hear the independent oscillators themselves. If I turn that down and turn ring oscillator 1 level up, that's the original sawtooth wave from oscillator 1. Furthermore, we can also hear oscillator 2. There's the sine wave. And this is what I'm talking about with these on-off buttons. I'm going to turn partial 2 off. Doesn't matter. You're still hearing the oscillator because it's basically being routed through a kind of broken circuit here. It's going into partial 1, but you're just hearing oscillator 2 all on its own. And so you can now mix these sounds together. You've got your ring modulated sound and your two original unadulterated oscillators, and you can mix all of those together. Now that's great and really flexible, and apart from the fact that we've got this spurious on-off button, I've got no problem with that at all. The difficulty comes when we switch to sync mode. So we're going to have a chat about what sync mode is first, and then we'll talk about why I'm not particularly happy with the way it's being implemented. I'm going to get myself back to the completely simple pseudo sine wave that we started with earlier. So here's my partial 1 sine. I'm going to engage sync mode. Sounds louder. That's the issue that I've got. When you engage sync mode, partial 2, even though it's turned off, is being routed to the output. So you're hearing partial 2 in all its glory. If I turn partial 2 into a sawtooth wave, what you're going to see in the oscilloscope is a combination of a sine wave plus a sawtooth wave. That's what those two waves look like when they're mixed together. If I turn sync off and turn both partials on, exactly the same. So that's an issue for me. I don't want to hear the original unadulterated oscillator 2, partial 2, but that's what we do. So just as a heads up, that's what's going on. Now let's go on to talk about what sync is. Sync mode has locked these two oscillators together. In this frame of reference, partial 1 is known as a slave and partial 2 is known as a master. Partial 2 gets to decide what the pitch of partial 1 is. This is critically important. The easiest way to demonstrate it is to go to our pitch map. Now just take it from me, it doesn't matter whether or not this button is on or off. I'm going to turn it on because I've now got access to the user interface, but it's making no effect on the sound. I'm going to hold the key down, turn the volume down a little bit, and I'm going to increase the tuning of partial 2. I'm just going to take a snapshot of the oscillator so we can talk about what's going on. What's happening there is that you're hearing the sine wave that ordinarily would be partial 1. We're dealing with 2 sine waves here, so we shouldn't be seeing a complex shape like this. But because I've increased the pitch of partial 2, it's now oscillating faster than partial 1. And every time partial 2 finishes one of its periods, when it finishes drawing one complete cycle, it instructs partial 1 to begin redrawing its wave from the beginning. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing the partial 1 waveform being drawn, and then an instruction at this point coming from partial 2 to say start again. And so it abandons what would ordinarily be this little bit of the sine curve. It jumps right back to the beginning and starts drawing the wave again. And so if I increase the tuning of partial 2, we're now at 4 semitones. Now we've got a bigger vertical line here representing the fact that oscillator 1 has drawn even less, or partial 1 has drawn even less of a single wave before it receives that instruction from partial 2 to start again. Now what you get here is a very artificial sounding wave. This can't be generated via any other form of synthesis, and this process is typically known as hard sync or sync. First arose in analog synths in the 70s, I think, mid-70s. And suddenly hard sync appeared everywhere. All the different manufacturers started jumping on this bandwagon because it's such a unique and idiosyncratic sound. It really tailored the sound of those analog synths from the 70s and 80s. Now we're just listening to sine waves here, so there's only so interesting that can be. But if I make the slave a sawtooth instead, and I'm also going to reset my tunings. Now what I'm going to do is start playing with the coarse tuning of the slave oscillator. So this is partial 1 I'm going to start messing with. And this is where sync really starts coming into its own. Because when you change the tuning of the slave oscillator, you don't get a change in pitch. You get a tonal variation instead. All of these notes are being registered as C on the tuner. And that kind of glassy, metallic sound is a pretty classic hard sync sort of sound. And what you're getting there is the original oscillator trying to oscillate much faster than this, but these instructions coming in from oscillator 2 at a different rate. That's what's actually informing the pitch of the tone. Xmod is a frequency modulator, so now partial 1 is having its pitch modulated by the oscillator from partial 2. So this is frequency modulation, and it sounds like frequency modulation. Get us back to our really simple sine wave. Even though it doesn't matter, I'll leave partial 2 turned off just to take it completely out of the equation. It's not partial 2 that's generating the tone here. Then we've got frequency modulation. Xmod 1-2 depth determines how much frequency modulation. You can also get independent outputs from the oscillators. So here's oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 independent levels. It's not quite the same as the ring modulator. If I turn both of these off, you'll get no sound. So there's the modulated oscillator, and here's the original modulator. So that's just the sine tone, the sine wave that's coming out of oscillator 2. So Xmod is pretty straightforward because frequency modulation, although it's a complicated subject, at least we're capable of understanding what's going on. Roland have changed their minds over the years as to what Xmod or cross modulation was. In some synthesizers it was actually amplitude modulation, but for this particular implementation it is FM. You can also see, I've not particularly talked about this graphical interface, but you can see the route via which the cross modulation is occurring as well. Here's partial 2, we choose the pitch of partial 2, goes into the oscillator, generates a wave, that wave then modulates the pitch of oscillator 1, this link here. And I'm going to press Xmod 2 now, and you'll see a second line appear here. I've got absolutely no idea what Xmod 2 does. The closest I've been able to come to an explanation, and it isn't an explanation at all, in the Roland Phantom manuals, this is a different synthesizer, at least you have graphical representations of the algorithms. I can't even guarantee that this is what's going on in the Zenology, but if you can make any sense of those circuit diagrams, it's beyond me. But there's something going on here with the cross-modulation depth that frankly I haven't got a clue what's going on. I might not be able to tell you what it does, but I can tell you what it sounds like. So here's Ep.2. I've set up sawtooth waves for both partials. I've offset the coarse tuning by 5 semitones, so partial 1 is at +5. And then over in the Pro Edit screen, I've got Ep.2 depth, which is here. In all honesty, I can't even tell you whether this is AM or FM. I've actually got a suspicion it's amplitude modulation. If you have a look at the harmonics in the lower window, you'll see that they're bouncing up and down. That's a change in volume. What you do get is a pretty harmonically rich sound. We're only interested in what it sounds like at the end of the day, aren't we? It's a radically different sound from Xmod, which is your typical FM. Really fast vibrato effect. While we're in the Pro Edit screen, let's just have a quick look at phase lock. This basically resets the oscillators every time I press a key. I've reset the pitches of both of my partials to flat. Every one of those notes sounds identical. Now you get subtle differences in the sound of each of the notes as they're pressed, because those oscillators are slightly out of sync. So what phase lock is doing is basically guaranteeing that every time I press a note, they're both starting from the same place and you get a complete consistency. Not quite done yet. I'm going to turn the structure back to off, jump over to the oscillator page and engage an option called FXM. Now this stands for frequency cross modulation. I've got no idea why it's called frequency cross modulation when there's something else in the synthesizer called cross modulation. Come on guys, give us a chance. But I think what's going on here is that you've got an extra set of frequency modulation waves available that you can't see. So per oscillator, for each of the oscillators, it looks like it's got 4 internal modulating waves that, depending on what the color, you get an additional frequency modulation effect without having to combine multiple oscillators together. So we've clearly got FM there, and as we go through the color options, we've got 4 different options. Feels like a bit of a curious tag on to me, those options. I can't really see a use case for them. They seem a bit narrow to me, but if you like the sound of that particular cross-modulation effect, then, you know, go for it. Final thing to mention, everything we've talked about today has been in virtual analog mode, but you can sync PCM sounds together from this limited subset of options. So if we put our oscillators in PCM Sync mode, then you can sync them together. You can use the various options. This is the only way that you can synchronize PCM sounds together. So if I choose PCM Sync options for both of these partials, that's how you sync PCM sounds together. Okay, definitely in need of a cup of tea. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you next time for hopefully something a little bit easier. Thanks a lot.